Hello, all. Am I audible? Yeah. So let's start our today's session. Good evening, everyone. Today we have Victoria joining us from Seattle in US. Victoria is international coordinator for Clean Mobility Collective, and she has great experience, over 10 years of experience in working with community organizing and coalition building on environmental campaigns. She, okay, 1 minute. Oh, so many AI pop-ups are coming. So sorry about it. So, as I said, she has 10 years of experience in building communities and working in various campaigns related to environment. And today, Victoria will be sharing us about the climate, the Clean Mobility Collective, and as well as her work on this and on this sector. Over to you, Victoria.
Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Actually,
Thank you so
you're not
much.
audible.
Oh,
Yes.
Oh, I mean, I can hear her.
oh, shit. Can you all hear me? Am I coming in okay?
I can. Yeah,
Okay,
at
okay.
least.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Let me know if anything, if I cut out for any reason. But yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me join today. I'm really excited for this conversation. I've been learning a bit more about this program lately, and I'm excited to have this time with you. So yeah, I'll start with sharing some of the information that I have, and then looking forward to seeing what, dialogue and insights you all might have too that I can learn from. But yeah, just to say again, I'm the international coordinator for the global network called the Clean Mobility Collective, of which Sustera is a member. And I'm based in Seattle, which is for geography in the northwest corner of the United States. So it's opposite time zones right now. It's early in the morning for me, and I appreciate you all being on in the evening to accommodate this conversation. But yeah, I'm going to start to share today a bit about what organizing is and why organizing individuals and organizing organizations or network building is an effective way to build power to create change in the world. So on my background, how I think about organizing, I'll start with that, and then talk about, why network building matters. So I spent 7 years as a community organizer. Actually, I think 8. I have to do some math, but working on a number of campaigns, mostly related to stopping the expansion of oil and gas projects in the United States and Canada. And organizing is one of those terms that I think people often use without having a shared definition of, and I think that can be exacerbated too across language and cultural context. So I'm speaking here about community organizing, which I define as bringing people together to act on something that they want to change and that they care about. And this includes a few different things. So one, empowering people with the skills they need to work on whatever issue that they care about, right? I think it's really important not to just, you can bring people in on one issue, but the goal is to give them the ability to go forth and work on whatever issue they care about and know how to politically or socially engage on that. And then it's also the process of building power by enlisting impacted people to advocate for their own solutions, which I'll say more on, and then also creating resilient communities that are ready to respond when more things might happen, which unfortunately often is the case. So organizing is based on the belief, that communities have the power to advocate for their own best interest. And so particularly folks who have been harmed most by systematic inequalities in their context, they're going to know what needs to change more than people who haven't experienced that inequality. And when everyday people work together, they have the ability to change and dismantle those systems that don't benefit them. And it, when we work with centering the people who are most impacted, we're able to really envision and build a just world that challenges decision makers to be better to serve what their community wants, right? So it's really making sure that the vision for what comes next or what's different comes from those people. But organizing people is relationship focused, and no matter how much people care about an issue or are impacted by an issue, people are really busy and there's a lot going on in their lives, and they continue to make time for it only if they're community with others who are doing the same. So I actually think this space is a really good example of it, right? So like, how are we building connections with people who also want to be, who are also caring about this issue? Because people are only going to come back when they feel appreciated and are part of a team or are having fun. And those are key principles, actually, I think, in how we do this work. And it's that return that helps build the consistency and momentum needed to win campaigns. So if people show up once or twice, that's great, but we actually need to retain them to actually continue to work on campaigns to see what we want. The other thing I'll just note is that often campaign success is we can fall into a pit hole where we define it as achieving greater numbers all the time, but I think it's critical to think about growth in terms of depth as well. So the strongest organizing glue is those relationships. So rather than striving for large numbers out of the gate, we should focus on empowering existing volunteers to lead others. So while maybe getting to 50 people that work on your campaign once a year would be awesome, we could also shift that goal to think about having 20 of them, but who show up every single month, and then work on training them in the skills that they're wanting to learn, and then supporting them to go on and leading their own teams of volunteers, right? So it's kind of like going deep early to then get to that scale later on, which I'm happy to answer any questions about too. But anyway, I start with community organizing because there's many of the same principles there that are also core to organizing individuals, recruitment, relationship building, leadership development, that also apply to network building. So how do we organize organizations? So to talk more about the Clean Mobility Collective, which we often refer to as the CMC. So if you hear me say CMC, that's the abbreviation. The network started in response to the impacts, what's going on in the global transport sector and what's having on climate and communities. So I'll just say a little bit of background on that before I get more into network building. And I'm just going to have a sip of my morning tea because I'm a little groggy. Okay, so each region and country and community in which CMC partners work. So we're working in the US and Canada, Europe, India, Southeast Asia, and we're expanding to Latin America. Of course, everywhere has their own unique contexts and challenges, right? Like even within India, like you drive 20 minutes and things change, I'm sure, or you move 20 minutes and things change. But universally, we are seeing several things, including a rise in traffic and polluting vehicles that need to be addressed across the transport sector. So, I've said this before as it relates to organizing, but also like we know there are certain communities that are bearing the brunt of impacts of polluting transport systems, like often facing combined effects of poverty and classism or other inequities. And then also since our inception, we've been responding to the rise of online shopping, which is also a universal thing. It's been growing exponentially since the time the network started in 2021, and the cost of convenience of online shopping falls disproportionately on workers. And then lastly, the voices of people who are most vulnerable, particularly young people, leaders from the global south, they're often overlooked and not meaningfully included, even with existing climate advocacy spaces, especially as that relates to an international platform. So that's why in 2021, the idea for an international network working to address the emissions and public health crisis in the global transport sector was started. It's actually probably started in 2020, but we got working on it in 2021. And since it was the height of the pandemic and e-commerce, the associated deliveries were increasing exponentially. And so that was our initial focus area that we started on. So we recruited representatives from organizations, hired some staff in some of those key countries I mentioned, and we brought together partners first at the regional level, so what was happening in country, what should be worked on, and then we had our first in-person global meeting to co-create a shared vision. So through several days of conversation, we decided on a vision that was around, making sure that people value clean air, safe transportation, green spaces, and socially responsible companies. Like we did have a focus also on how would we move companies to take action for, mobility and good delivery systems that put people first. And so that was, and also making sure that we had public transit that would be electrified and accessible. So those are some of the big picture things that we knew we wanted to work for. So we were just kind of setting out the bones of what the network would be. And to achieve that vision, we said we would focus on delivery companies, getting them to 100% zero emission deliveries. We'd focus on working at the local and city level to adopt regionally relevant policies that would move us closer to clean and climate resilient urban mobility. We'd really also focus on recognizing and elevating local communities and leadership impacted by delivery and transportation systems, and maximize our collective power during key campaign moments. So where there's shared goals or targets across global regions, and what would we do together? So those early stages of the network are critical, and I share them as an example really when we think about network building and some of the key principles.
Victoria, I'm really
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt. Did you mean to share your
course.
screen? Or
Oh no.
are you just talking? Yeah, because we don't
Is
see
my
anything.
screen being shared? Oh, is my screen
Oh
being
no,
shared?
no, it's not being shared. I just wanted to make sure you didn't share.
Oh
Yeah.
no, when I had spoke with the folks at Sustera, they had felt that it would be better to see my face and have more of a dialogue.
Yes.
I think my
Yes, that's fine.
slides were maybe shared before the call.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Okay.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I just wanted to make sure. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. I think if maybe people don't have them, maybe they can be shared in the chat, Shini. Yeah.
Sure. I will share in the WhatsApp.
Okay, great. I know it's a lot to share at once. So, I have a few more minutes and then we can just open up to a conversation too. Okay, cool. Yeah, so using the Clean Mobility Collective as an example of network building. So some of the key principles around network building, definitely co-creation. So what are you working towards that's actually shared? Have people plan together? Is there a shared sense of ownership? Trust and relationship building. So do people know each other? Do they understand what the unique and different approaches are coming from different places? Is space made to talk about how and why decisions are being made? And then a value proposition. So is there a clear reason we're coming together? Are those participating do they get what the benefits they receive are, be it learning exchange or funding opportunities, et cetera? Like these are some of the core things that we want to be making sure we're thinking about as we start to bring organizations together. And, oftentimes the terms network and coalition are used interchangeably. And while similar in concept and very much context dependent, so like, they both bring different organizations together to do something. I think they're fundamentally different and in that networks establish more flexibility, both in the internal structure and decision-making processes, as well as in external facing campaigns. Coalitions tend to be more rigid and offer a model that works better when organizations are operating in the same context on a specific issue. But that being said, coalitions and networks come in all shapes and sizes, and networks, wanting to offer groups space to define together what the structure with the initiating group will be is key to creating something worthwhile and effective, right? Because people are bought into what it looks like. So just a few more things on networks. So directed networks. So there's more definitions. There's directed networks, there's distributed networks. People think about them in different ways. But there's different models, and to speak to a couple of them. So there can be networks that have a central team and campaign that then offer instructions out to participating groups on where and how to plug in. So it's pretty, there's some level of a hierarchy, that there's like a central team that's just making the decisions that everybody else agrees to then follow. Whereas distributed networks bring groups under more of an umbrella framework or larger shared goal, but then give organizations greater autonomy to run campaigns that contribute back to that framework. And the CMC started with a directed slant, so to get e-commerce companies to commit to zero emission deliveries. But we've really evolved over time to become more of a hybrid between that distributed and directed elements, given the diversity of our global partners and the context in which they work, and really involving them in decision making. And so oftentimes networks can fall apart if there isn't space for that evolution. And so to get to our current iteration of the CMC, we've just been going through a multi-month process in which partners were consulted at various stages to reflect changes that would serve the groups participating. And also, as networks grow and change, something to be thinking about is also measuring evaluation and learning systems that are important to establish. And this is a principle in organizing as well, which is a challenge. It's about how do we set, clear indicators on what success is, often around qualitative relationships, which can be challenging. But the qualitative is important. And quantitative, both you need both your qualitative and quantitative measurements, and it's going to change based on what the current structure of your network is. So yeah, it's a lot to set up an effective network. Those are some high level points. But why we do it is also like, why do we do it? Because networks, they are an effective way to build power. And they platform organization initiated work. So it's like, some of the benefits for groups to participate is that, if I have a local campaign, I'm having trouble getting the word out about what's happening, I can have this other group of organizations that are committed and able to help me share out about it, and help bring in a broader audience. There's also we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So if there's another group in another place that's working on something similar, learning exchange and transference of best practice really helps us, scale what's already worked and be more effective on a shorter time period instead of everybody trying to figure it out sort of in their own place. And we've seen that a lot with clean air zones or zero emission zones in the Clean Mobility Collective. And then leadership and skills development. So, with a network, if your network is paying attention to the partners in it, you'll have more insight into what common strengths and challenges are. And so then, trainings can be designed and offered that are specific to what people want to learn about. So say it be media relations or fundraising or digital engagement, it can be more curtailed to what your group of organizations wants to learn and then become a benefit for them to participate. Storytelling is also really important because networks can better thread together many different groups' works into a bigger picture. And I guess an example of this would be for the CMC, we had this idea at one of our past global convenings born, which is called Life of the Bubble. And so it's an art installation that depicts how we're on track for a future where only a privileged few will have access to clean air. And so some of our partners did this in the Philippines, where they got this actually famous actor to be posing inside this bubble where he had clean air, and then had a bunch of people outside the bubble who were wearing respirators. And it got a ton of news because they got a really prominent person to do it. They did it in 2 different places in the Philippines. And now they're working with some of our other partner organizations in Bogota to recreate the action. And we're anticipating it happening in a couple of other places. So then, that's a good example of how we can be creating a story that transcends one place. And that's a good benefit of doing some of this network building. And lastly, I'd say it's also about facilitating strategic alliances. So when groups partner together, they can create campaigns that better reach key audiences that they need to be working with. And I think it might be giving groups access to relationships that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And so, for example, CMC has had some worker-led groups involved because we know that labor and environmental advocates have to work together, which has been important for groups to learn about how to build relationships with workers. Okay, I'm almost done. I'll say a global network serves an even more particular role. And just in the CMC's development, we're really thinking about what it means to act locally and think globally, right? So, our issues aren't happening in isolation, especially as it relates to how dirty vehicles are moving from the global north to the global south, as policies are created on clean transportation, as it relates to mineral extraction and a lot of other issues. So working together is really important. Especially multinational companies are acting irresponsibly all over the place. So we need sort of coordinated way to hold them accountable in many places. And, that we really want to be thinking about how do we work together in key spaces to make sure that we scale local stories globally. And what I'll close with is that, I work with CMC because I really love the people who run the organizations, and how inspiring I find it to be part of a global community. And also because after working as a community organizer myself, I know how intensive that work can be and what supporting it looks like. And that I think that's what's unique about the CMC is our local to global connection. So there's a lot of international spaces that work only with groups who are engaging on national issues. But there's so much to learn in bringing people together who are working on solutions at that level. So yeah, I will also say that if you are interested in learning more about the CMC, we have a quarterly newsletter. So I could follow up if somebody sent me a list of people's emails who wanted to be on our newsletter. That also gives updated information about, if we're hosting any sort of like public events or to learn about what's happening across the organizations that we work with. And yeah, I'll stop there for now. I'm happy to have a little discussion and answer any questions.
Thank you, Victoria. I think I can put a poll on WhatsApp group and to collect the emails of the participants who like to have the newsletters. So we have the first question from Vishnu Mohan. Vishnu was asking about your experience you had on Southeast Asia or India. Maybe the organizations or partners you are working with, or any specific issue you have involved in.
Yeah, definitely. So I think a good example of this, I mentioned that we've been working on e-commerce companies and getting to zero emission deliveries. So we put together a number of global reports, let's see, we put together, I think, three different global reports. And so we faced a lot of challenges during that process. And how do we work with a researcher to get numbers? At the time, we were working in Europe, the US, and India. And so how do we get information about what's happening with delivery companies in all of these countries, but then also create it into a report that actually will grab media or reflect the context in which we're talking about these issues? And how do we make like one document about them? And it was definitely challenging thinking about how do we have both global North and global South contexts together, especially in the approach of like, how do we work with companies? And so it took a lot, of time and long meetings with all the organizations and the researchers that we had. And I was sort of the go-between between a lot of our partners and the research group. And so in my experience, I think like some of the principles that I had said earlier, that like we had a lot of fundamental trust that we had built before we started working on those reports. And I think that really helped when there were also like potential miscommunications where it's like we thought it was going to be this way and then now it's this way, to be able to be like, oh, okay, like let's take our time, go through the draft, we can bump our deadline and make sure it's actually going to work for especially the Indian media context. And the groups that are working with in India have like really powerful media skills and like we're able to run with the reports once we actually made sure we got it right. But I think it's just a good example of making sure that like if you have good rapport with the groups that you work with, being really mindful that like they know their context best, they know what's going to work best. And if you slow down to get it right, it's going to only pay dividends.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm kind of curious. I'm also based in the US right now in Illinois, and I'm kind of curious, like which e-commerce companies you worked with here in the US context.
Yeah, so
And how that went.
Yeah,
if you had any
totally.
pull.
Yeah, great question. I can follow up also with sending the links to some of the reports that I'm mentioning. So what we had started with was 6 companies, if I can rattle them off on my top of my head. It was like UPS, FedEx, Amazon, Walmart, DHL, and Flipkart, which is a subsidiary of Walmart that operates a lot in India and has done great work on zero emission deliveries. So those were the 6 big companies that we started with. And we did a report sort of benchmarking them in late 2021 on sort of like who has even made a commitment? How does that fall in their overall environmental commitments? And then we sort of went through a process globally where we decided we wanted to pick one of those to be like our main target. And we did go with Amazon and launched a campaign on Amazon called Deliver Change. And we've been running that for a number of years now. As a network, as a global network, this is a good example also. We universally picked Amazon as a target because it operates in so many of the countries in which we work, but it also doesn't operate in all of the countries in which we work. But it felt like the country that was moving most towards, global takeover in a lot of ways. So it would behoove us to work on them. Since then, we're pivoting the campaign actually, where Amazon will still be the target for the US CMC partners, but we are working on more regional level targets because, again, there's a difference in how the groups are working with the companies in different parts of the world. So in the US, it is an external pressure campaign. There have been actions outside of Amazon's headquarters that are much more confrontational than it is safe or politically savvy to do so in other parts of the world. And so we are sort of still having our Deliver Change overall messaging, and we're actually working towards a global digital strategic communications plan. That was a lot of words. A digital push for later in the year that'll bring together all of the different targets globally. But we did again have to evolve and pivot because even though we all had agreed to this one target, then in reality it actually wasn't playing out that made the most sense. And so there have been some of our US meetings have had a couple of US groups have had a couple of meetings with Amazon. So we've seen a little bit of traction, but it's definitely a hard campaign. And we've had more progress in some of the other parts of the world on more regional level companies. I think in India, for example, with Flipkart and Zomato, which is much more of a partnership relationship. So it changes in a lot of different places, but how are we tying that together with Global Glue has been part of it.
Okay, thank you. That's really insightful.
Yeah. And we can share those reports too.
Krishna was also asking about the two types of network that you have shared, and also asking about the areas on which CMC is working, for example, advocacy, research, finance, support, etc.
Yeah. To say again, yeah. So again, these definitions can be squishy, but I think it's important to try to get to the bottom of them because it really can impact how we set up structures for networks. And so the two that I was talking about again, there's a directed network approach and then a distributed network approach. And again, this isn't like CMC, I think we fall in between those two. But a directed network is more like, okay, we all have agreed that a certain set of us will help define, how do we move a company, for example. And then we're going to tell everybody else, here's what they need to do on XYZ timeline on XYZ day. And everybody's like, cool, we'll do that. And it takes a lot of it can take more tight coordination. And it's, I think it's still different from a coalition in that there's usually more flexibility still, even within that directed approach. Whereas distributed is more like we have this overall framework, and then we all are plugging into it. So we have a big picture shared goal, but we're all maybe getting there in slightly different ways. And we're coordinating on how we get there, but we're all have our autonomy to run our own thing. And there can be pros and cons to both of these different approaches. And I think when you have a network that's global or large enough, like the CMC, we have elements of both of those in our network. And so we've seen our Deliver Change campaign at times be more directed, even though that's actually moving to be a little bit more distributed too. Whereas our overall network, which includes other priorities like active mobility solutions and public transit policies, that's more of a distributed model. Yeah, but it's a lot of it's good to be conscientious when you start about which approach you might be taking, and then you can always work with the groups that you're working with to change it. But it is a little bit of a different approach.
Great. Anika was sharing about the Flipkart is the subsidiary of Walmart, and so I have a question. I think we have to, as in the sustainable mobility, we have to also discuss about the transition minerals. There is a webinar by the CMC about that, and it's the first time I heard about you and also about the transitional minerals. I think you can share what's happening around it a little bit. You could.
Yeah. So some of the work on transition minerals at this time for us is like, it's really important that we aren't shifting harm and where it's happening from one place to another. And that's what we've been thinking a lot about as it relates to the transport solutions. And we, early on as a network and thinking about this, really made sure that, our original ask of companies and of cities was to advocate for 100% zero emission fleets. And while that is what we want to get to, we made a really conscientious language change to say 100% zero emission deliveries, or zero emission deliveries, not necessarily. And that was because we wanted to make it really clear, and we did in our demand set, that we don't want just a one-to-one conversion. So like every auto now becomes an electric van, or every car becomes an electric van. Like we want to see electric vans, and we need them, and we need deliveries to happen that way. But we also need we need companies and cities to create more solution sets also. Like, how can we have like pickup locations where people can walk to get their package instead of getting it delivered directly to their front doorstep? Or how can we be requiring truck trips to be optimized so that they're not going out 60% full, but only when they're 100% full. And so those types of things are, as we think about transition minerals, that those are not endless in quantity, and that there's a cost to extracting them, at least currently how they're doing right now. And so if we can do our best, even as we advocate for these solutions, to put, guardrails on how much and what we need, that's something that we are really trying to be mindful of as a network. And then as it relates to I think that there's also just more education we can be doing with our partners around this. And I think that there is like this there can be a rub happening in the transport sector among organizations that are advocating for electric vehicles and those that are advocating for active mobility. And it's like, we really need both, and we really need to be, and public transportation, of course. And so that we're trying to really strike that balance at CMC in advocating for all of these solution sets. And part of that has also been, offering our members, webinars or information about critical mineral stuff, but also in our newly developed theory of change for the next 3 years. We have these sort of cross-regional projects that are like, how are organizations in different parts of the world working together to advance our shared network objectives? And one of those is solutions for harm reduction. So we're thinking about what can we focus in on as it relates to, how global North solution sets aren't creating more burden on global South countries, and also laterally, like it's not always just that dynamic, but we have the mineral stuff in our mind too, but we're actually looking more closely at the truck dumping work stuff, and we're piloting, potentially looking at specifically how it relates to the US and Latin America, as we're starting the CMC in Latin America, and we think that would potentially be one of their anchor issues. So there'll be a lot to learn from that, and then how it may evolve for us to take on more of the transition mineral work as a global network, or other topics over the next several years is yet to come. But yeah, I'll pause there. That was a lot.
I have a question to kind of build off of what you just said. Do you think CMC would ever consider ship breaking and like shipping as one of the mobility issues?
Really good question. We've thought about this. So especially as it relates to freight overall, and so we're thinking in all the ways we can categorize many partners work. We have like sort of, we have buckets under movement of people and then movement of goods. And especially, so actually prior to being the international coordinator for the network, I was the US coordinator, and we have regional coordinators. I think Siddharth came to talk with you all, Sid, who's the India coordinator right now, a week or two ago. And when I was working with the US partners and we were going through this co-creation process to be like, what should the network look like in the US? How would that scale to this global network? What do we want to work on? The problem there is really defined as like, it's not just about last mile delivery. It's not just what's happening when the package goes out to the delivery. It's like what's happening at the warehouses and what's happening before, like on the heavy duty trucks before it gets there, and on the boats that then come into the port, right? So there's definitely in the US context more thinking about how the freight system is connected, and how when we talk about last mile delivery, we have to be talking about all the other phases where people are being impacted. And our US previous anchor organization has done some work on shipping. There's a campaign that Deliver Change, our CMC corporate campaign, was working on, called Ship at Zero, which is around also holding companies accountable to getting to zero emission maritime shipping, which is on a longer timeline because those vessels are pretty hard to electrify at this point. But the CMC, we have some groups that have looked a little bit at maritime work, but we're kind of focusing, at least for the next couple of years, on ground transportation, just seeing that as more, if anything, like there's more possibility for there to be common denominators around like heavier duty trucks in different countries, at least in our set of partners right now. But it might come in some of the storytelling we do, even if we're not directly advocating on some of the maritime work, but to talk about, how we need a freight system, how we need a goods movement system that, is cleaner and safer for people. So that's, it is definitely present for us. And, I could send you some resources if you're interested too, in just learning more about maritime stuff, because it's a whole nother set of worms.
Thank you, Victoria. So Ashta was asking, how does CMC measure the success in its initiative in promoting clean mobility?
This question hits hard for me right now because we're in the process of developing our new framework. So when I say framework, sorry, I mean measuring, evaluation, and learning indicators. So how are we, I touched on that a little bit, that it's really important to do that because I think individual organizations have a great handle on, what they achieved. But for a network model, it's like, how do we measure what all of these groups are doing related to our work? And I think something that's also really important in this, and comes up a lot with our partners, is this idea of contribution versus attribution. So how does how can we say something, it's something that we can attribute to what CMC did if it's one partner that did it in their context, whether or not CMC supported it or it was related back to the network, right? So it's like, it can get a little bit sticky. And we've worked on having clear categories, which I think has been helping us, on when network partners have led on something, when they have contributed to something, or when they've supported it. So that helps us sort of break down like how big of a role the network played in achieving XYZ policy. And so we have a lot of different indicators to measure, what was successful. And we sort of broken them down in a way that matches sort of how we organize our work around movement of goods and movement of people, but also our network building work. And so there are some things that we can measure really quantitatively, right? So like how many policies passed on clean air zones. But oftentimes there's so much more to measure around how successful we are that aren't just the policy outcome. I think this also applies to companies, right? It's like, no, we haven't gotten Amazon to commit zero deliveries yet, but like, how many meetings have we had with the company? How many public facing stories have we gotten? How many, other companies, smaller companies have taken action since this campaign was launched? And that goes also with policy work too, right? Like, how many roundtables or discussions did we bring advocates to with decision makers? So trying to, as a global network, it's a balance between trying to get to some of those more comprehensive breakdown, be aside the number, that sort of get at some more of the qualitative work that all of the work that happens before you see a policy outcome or a corporate commitment, while also making it not overburdensome, right? That also is always a battle too in how we measure, right? Like, wanting to make sure it's actually getting us to be reflective of what the work actually is, but also it can be really labor intensive to report every single thing we're doing every day. So trying to sort of create a way for us to do that accomplishes both. Okay, looks like there's maybe some more questions in the chat. I'll take your lead,
Yes,
Shini.
there is most questions. So Vishnu was asking about he's curious to know your take around EVs, and one of the challenges for more EV adoption is charging infrastructure gaps. What has worked on West? Are there different policies to be advocated in developing countries for better charging infrastructure and hence better EV adoption? Are there interesting business models to explore to bring more entrepreneurs to charging infrastructure?
Really good question. Yeah. A few things on this. One, it's funny. I mean, I'll give a pass at an answer, but I actually think Sid is such a EV whiz in the Indian context that following up with him on this question would be a good idea too. So I think some of the things, we as a network, it's good you mentioned this because we as a network haven't really gone into charging infrastructure in our big picture goals, but we've been recognizing it more lately as key for enabling conditions, right? So we kind of have this new area that we're trying to work on to be like, understanding what the barriers are for companies or cities to be making these commitments, and obviously charging infrastructure is a big piece of it. I think one of the things that has worked, what we've seen working well is when we see a partnership of city and companies on, a rollout plan for some of this. Like, I think we can have companies that are making private commitments, but the problem with that is that oftentimes if they're building EV infrastructure, it's only for their own vehicles and it's in an isolated setting. And so then, it becomes a barrier for maybe companies that haven't set aside the funding to do that, or are more isolated in whatever their location is. And so when we see cities and companies partnering together, we often are able to then see more community-based, or at least like multi-company charging stations set up. And so then that breaks down some of the access issues and space allocation issues that we're seeing in a lot of places on building this out. And so, yes, it definitely then leads to more EV adoption. We're also going to be, don't quote me on this because we're trying to pull it together now, but we should be having a webinar later this month if we get our speakers in order. That'll be actually hearing more from small operators on what some of the barriers are and how they've overcome that, especially to charging infrastructure. And I think that there's a lot of really good insights that we can be learning from small operators as well as the big companies on how to sort of roll this out. So that should be coming, and we can hopefully, I think that'll be like, CMC and friends. So we open it up to a broader audience later this month, which will probably be able to get into more detailed information sort of about what some of those business models to explore will be. Yeah.
Tanaka.
Yeah, Victoria, just kind of like a side thing again related to charging infrastructure. We're currently working on getting charging smart adoption in the state of Indiana. I work for Indiana University Bloomington, and so we serve local governments. And one of the things that we've heard from folks such as like EVgo and other charging infrastructure vendors is that they don't necessarily like entering into cities where there's a lot of bureaucratic hurdles and they haven't actually streamlined their zoning policies, their land use permitting inspection codes. And so we are trying to kind of clear the road for companies like that and the cities themselves and individuals who would like to not feel charging anxiety. And the Charging Smart program is how we're doing it. I thought, might be useful for you to know. And it's a national program, so you might actually find it in Washington as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That sounds great. I will definitely check it out. There's also definitely, I think maybe some more lessons learned. There's the University of Washington, if you haven't seen it, their freight center, their urban freight center has a lot of different resources. I think they have a whole section on church infrastructure case studies too that might be worth checking out. I can drop their website in the chat too.
So Anaka was also asking about case studies of successful campaigns with methods, lesson learned, etc.
Yeah, is
Yeah,
that
she's putting it in the chat, I think, just now.
Yeah. Sorry. Oh, it's covered. Is there any other questions from participants? Yes,
Is there
Anaka?
a way we can get involved? I mean, maybe not as employees, but as, volunteers. I don't know. Are you like a 501c3?
Good question.
So like donations?
Yeah, great question. We're not registered, which is an interesting we might register ourselves, but it's funny in the network model, right? Because we're made up of many over 100 501c3s in their own context, at least, or nonprofit-like entities. But so we're not personally registered. And so I think the best way, getting you all in the newsletter, sending you all opportunities for the webinar, and then I think like regional coordinators are sort of the best tapped into sort of figuring out how folks can be plugging into their work. So Sid's a great person to reach out to into sort of what's happening in the India context. If you're interested in finding out if any of you are based in other places, like I could connect you to our US coordinator whose name is Michelle. And it's, but we rely on our organizations to run the campaigns in a lot of ways. And so if there's like, volunteer opportunities, sort of those organizations will be the best to sort of plug people into. And for us, we sort of like have either learning opportunities or webinars, or we have key moments, whether that's like, some of the like the life in the bubble things, some other types of like actions that happen, but those are all facilitated by our local groups. So they're sort of the best way to plug you all in more directly.
Okay. So on the is there any like a youth fellowship programs or anything that the participants can also part of? Like in the previous presentation, I got stuck by the CMC Youth Fellows uh, mentioning about that. So could you explain more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So we had an inaugural set of a dozen youth fellows from 2023 to 2024 for the CMC. And so these folks were incredible. There were 12 of them. They were from all different parts of the world in which the CMC works. Actually, they were all from the global South countries in which the CMC works. We really made sure we focused on really wanting to build out leadership in those regions. And so this was a year-long program where the fellows received a stipend to work on local campaigns that they cared about. And then they also had opportunities for mentorship with folks at the CMC or other organizations we partnered them with. And then we also had a whole learning series. So not dissimilar from the program here, but it was creating a cohort in a global space. So really making sure that people from different contexts, really different contexts, were able to come together and be in community together. And so it was a successful program. It was our first time, so we learned a lot and actually have been consulting a lot of our CMC partners on sort of what we should be doing differently for the next iteration of it. And what we're going to be doing for the next one is working more closely with CMC partners on making sure that youth fellows are embedded in CMC partners' local work. So we had a couple of fellows that were like working maybe in countries that we didn't have the CMC yet because we just did an open call for applications. And so that's going to be a key difference this year, is making sure that there's more of a long runway for continued engagement and support after the fellowship ends as well. We've still been in contact with those folks, but more sort of in their in the country in which they live. And so we're hoping to relaunch that later this year. And I'm not sure what our process will be for applicants, but should we do an open call? Of course, this would be a great place to put it out to. And we're probably thinking a cohort of about a dozen again. But in any case, we might do more, we might provide more of those opportunities, like trainings and stuff that we're doing specifically for the youth, to be open to a bit of a broader audience as well. So if that's something that happens too, I would love to, of course, include this space. And that's a great way also for people here to potentially plug into the global network more broadly. Like, those folks came to our global convening with all of our organizations, and it's a great opportunity to sort of learn more about organizations across the world, if that's something that you are interested in.
So thank you, Victoria, for that. And we have a question from Hina. So if someone has limited resources but strong determination, where should they begin? And what steps would you suggest to accelerate the climate movement in countries like India? Climate movement in countries like India. Am I clear?
Yeah. No, that made good sense. I think in terms of if you have strong motivation, I think finding an organization can be a really helpful way to proceed. I think that's one option, right? I think that it can be limiting in some ways if you can't find an organization that wants to support the idea or direction that you feel passionately about. But if you can, it's nice to sort of have that sort of landing spot to sort of start something from. So if that's available to you, that's one option. Another option, and this is something that we can make this group more aware of as well. And I think that there are probably some more India-specific opportunities too, but like, there are some micro grant, like we run a youth micro grant as the CMC, for example. And so that can be a really good way to sort of just get enough seed funding to start a project, because that it can be, I know it costs money to bring people together too, which is like, it's easier said than done to be like, we'll just start, meeting with people and having stuff happen. But like, if you don't actually have the resources available to continue that momentum, it's going to feel like, you weren't able to sustain, which makes a lot of sense. So the CMC, for example, we offer youth microgrants, which is different from our youth fellowship. They're grants of up to 6,000 Great British pounds, and they're meant to help people start or develop an idea that they have, and then hopefully be like a launch pad for their funding. So that's a good option, and I think that there's some India-specific things like that as well that are that would be good opportunities to flag for this space, of course. And then I think you had, how to accelerate some climate work in the India context. So one of the really awesome things that I have learned a lot from the India partners within the CMC is some of the innovation challenges that have happened. And if you all aren't, I don't know if Sid would have spoken with you all about this, but some really amazing work being done engaging young people on pitching ideas about, how could companies be electrifying their fleets more or whatever the topic might be, and then bringing that together in like an in-person sort of challenge where actually people from the company might come or other advocacy groups might come and then sort of pick the best idea and figure out how it could be supported. And that's something that we've also seen, at least in terms of the CMC, that has also extended into Southeast Asia. So our India and Southeast Asia partners have actually partnered based on the success of some of the Evolve or the innovation challenges in India to then replicate that with some university students and young people in the Philippines. And so that's a really great example. And I think that it's actually the kind of thing that we need to kickstart and keep inspiring momentum with climate solutions, because it energizes young people, but it's also like really inspiring for everyone that's participating and like witnessing the pitch ideas and just like getting a lot of really exciting possibilities out there. So I'm sure if you all don't have that, we can share information about it too. I'm not sure when the next one will be, but they've done it several times now. Yeah.
So Anu was asking about, in connection with organizing campaigns, what strategy can be adopted and work well in your experience for a condition where the higher power is not convinced for doing the campaign? And there is second part, curious to know whether CMC work on air emissions because traffic and dependency on air transport is more nowadays.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll take these. I think these have to be my last couple of questions, Arshini, just because I have to hop to another meeting. But yeah, great questions. Okay, yeah. So you're working on a campaign and you like are not making any progress. Like, what do you do? I think that it's important to be able to like I've used this word evolve a lot of times, but like how are you able to shift your strategy or your tactic if it's not working? I think one of the things as it relates to corporate campaigns, but also at the city level too, that I think is often overlooked. But how can you be building, to go back to building relationships, identifying who are the people doing business or who are the people that have economic ties to whatever your entity is. So if you're trying to move a company, for example, who, are the biggest other companies that they're doing work with. So I think there can often be something that's like called a proxy campaign that can be effective in moving your target if your target itself isn't moving. So let me think of an example of this. For maritime work, for example, some of those big shippers like, CMCG or whatever that acronym is, or Maersk, like those are companies that don't have the brand recognition, right? So like if you try and run a campaign on one of these, like nobody knows who they are, nobody necessarily cares what they do, except we do because we know how bad their, maybe environmental actions are. So their biggest buyer, for example, though, might be Amazon or might be another retail brand or something. And so how can you actually run a campaign on the retail brand instead, asking them to get to, the maritime target that you want, which is something that we saw in this campaign called Ship at Zero. And so I think it's just revisiting your power map and thinking also about like what's actually going to give them the reputational damage or reputational insecurity that will need them to take action. And I think that works in a government level too, just thinking about, who are the does your decision maker care about, and how can you be reevaluating that all the time and thinking about what's vulnerable? I mean, it's kind of a broad answer because it really is context dependent. But I would just say like revisiting that mapping about what your target cares about is really important. And then on air emissions, again, similar answer to maritime freight, right? Like it's part of the broader freight system. It's definitely where we're seeing some of the biggest increases, especially in a globalized goods movement system, transport system. One of our partners in the US has done some more air freight, which again, in some of the reports that I share, I'm happy to share about. But I think it also like it goes back to we're focusing our slice of the pie right now is ground transportation as CMC, but it's definitely needs to be part of a bigger story also about like how are we creating more localized supply chains? How are we creating more circular economies and like not flying stuff all over the world all the time? But that's sort of a different my comms lead would be like, okay, this narrative, like we kind of need to curtail it a little bit. So thinking also about, you know, corporate responsibility on that in terms of air emissions is also really important. And that's something we've seen some of our partners work on as it relates to limiting corporate travel. But for goods movement, it's a huge issue, and it's something that we may expand to more concertedly as well. But right now, it's sort of telling that story, similar to maritime emissions as well. Okay, I think I might need to
Yes.
wrap, Rashini.
Okay. Sure, Victoria. Thank you so much. Thank you for your insights. It's been very beneficial for all the participants. I think you should, as it is 3 minutes late, I think we can wind up here.
Yeah, okay. Well, it was so great to have this conversation with you all. Definitely feel free to share my email with folks. I just saw your note about that right before I got on. And yeah, good luck with everything you all are working on. And I'm really inspired that this group of humans exists and that you all are learning from each other and doing good work in the world. So thank you for everything and looking forward to hearing more about what's going on.
Bye.
Take
Thank you.
care. Good
Victoria.
night.
Thank you all. Good night. I think you can leave. It's fine. Yeah.